But if the introduction to the gospel is God's establishing a nation on earth, and he sent a king, Jesus, to establish his domain and reign, and eventually to overtake the whole entire earth. It's going to be his again, because it was his to begin with. He's reestablishing his domain and rule over all of men, over all of creation. When you tell those, and people are like, wow, that's intense.
Yeah.
I want in. I want to be a disciple of that. Now you tell that guy, okay, the king said, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. The king said, love your enemies. Then you're already disposed to say, well, he's the king. Like I'm in his nation. We have to do what the king says. It's an entirely different way to approach what Jesus is doing in his teachings.
Yeah. So that's a great springboard into politics, because like, would you say like that's kind of the underpinning theological framework for how you approach politics?
Yes, absolutely. Now we give that different terms. Like a lot of times we call it two kingdoms, and there's and that's a defensible term. I appreciate the term two kingdoms, but two kingdoms derives from kingdom. Like Jesus has to be a king to even begin to talk about two kingdoms. Two kingdoms is a more abstract concept, that there are only two powers in the world. There's this kingdom that Jesus is establishing and everything else. And it's kind of a little bit of a separate conversation, but it's like the first practical outworking of Jesus being the king. Because then you start, once you move from Jesus's kingship to two kingdoms, now we start to talk about where do our allegiances lie and how do we interact, because Jesus's kingdom obviously isn't a geopolitical state. It doesn't have a flag or a parliament, or it's not marked out on a map.
Right.
It's something else, and that something else that it is intangible. And so how does that intangible kingdom that's existing now interact with the existing powers that are, and what's the authority, and where do those existing powers that are come from? That's where we have to start wrestling with, well, what is allegiance and how does that concept work? What is authority and how does that concept work? All these other outworkings. So I start with kingdom, and then I recognize two kingdoms, and then we talk about how to live in between those spheres.
So what would be your answer? How would you answer people who can get behind, like I feel like a lot of maybe Reformed people are kind of getting to this place where they're like, yes, Jesus is a king,
right.
and he has,
he wants to take over the earth.
Right, he wants to take over the earth, and so then we're gonna do that by like
dominion.
By taking over politics, or by influencing politics, getting Christians into places of influence. It sounds very similar, but I think they're two different ideas. Or even using, you're using memes, you're taking something to spread the message of the kingdom or whatever.
Right.
How would you differentiate between what you believe and maybe what they're saying?
Yeah. So it comes down to, for me, it comes down to the law of the king. Like how did he tell us to exercise his authority on the earth? And there's some really uncomfortable things he says about that. Funny story. When we were young Christians, very young Christians, my car broke down in Chicago. I was moving from Michigan back to Oregon, and it was just Eric and I. My baby was with my mother-in-law. My very young baby was with my mother-in-law, and we were just going to drive for 2 days across the country. And we broke down in Chicago, and I broke down on the freeway, and my trailer broke. And an IDOT truck pulled over and picked up my trailer and pulled us up to the next off ramp. And we got off there. It was dark. It was an industrial area, and the tow truck driver was a black guy. And I looked around the neighborhood, and the streets were filling up, and people were starting to drag race down the street. And we were the only white people there. And I said, hey, man, are we going to be okay here? He's like, oh, yeah, you'll be fine. And then he looked around in the windows. He said, no, you got to get out of here. And so and so we had to go find somewhere else to stay. All this stuff happened. Like, it was a really intense neighborhood where we were broken down. I had to go into a Western Union and get $600 cash. And there's a prostitute in the corner and drug deals happening right next to me outside. And I'm like, oh man, this is not a good situation. So I'm like, I told Eric and I were talking about this. We're trying to figure out how to get out of here and how to get on our way. And she's like, she's trying to be faithful. And she's like, well, we'll be okay. I mean, God will protect us. I mean, he's not going to send us like sheep among wolves. And I was like, actually, there's a Bible verse. She didn't know the Bible. I was like, actually, it's kind of the other way around.
Yeah.
Those kind of experiences with like super practical words that Jesus says, like, they really run counter narrative. Like, we don't want to be sheep among wolves. We don't want to bear crosses. We don't want to love enemies. Like, these things still cut against the natural grain, and they have to be incorporated into what it means to be God's people on earth, because we see it in Jesus, right? We see it in his cross. We see it in his teaching. We see it in his compassion. We see it in the way that he works in his world, and he wants us to be the same people. He wants us to be his body. That means we should be reproducing what he was doing in the world. And that lamb among wolves, that meekness, that suffering kindness, that choice to suffer for love rather than to ever produce harm is what's upsetting the world. Like, a lot of this is tied into, you can't have a real conversation about kingdoms without having a conversation about violence and coercion and authority. They're in the concept of kingdom. And so when we look at how I like to think about it is this: turn an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is not an innovation of Moses. Like, retributive justice is a human thing. Like, every culture in every place that I know of practices retributive justice. What may be novel about Moses's prohibition is the limit on retributive justice, that you only get to take one eye for one eye, because the propensity is, if you take my eye, I'm going to take both of yours. If you take one of my teeth, I'm going to take three of yours. And what's novel about Moses is to prescribe limits on that, to say, if you take a tooth, you only take a tooth, and that there's some kind of like boundary set around it. But I feel like Jesus is coming as the new man, the new Adam, the new king. And he's saying to us, like, you've done the eye for an eye thing. Like, everybody gets that. Everybody knows how to do eye for eye. But what less evil does it make in the world? It doesn't make any less evil in the world. In fact, it only makes more. It just makes a bunch of people without eyes or without teeth, or that's all it can do. It can only try to put a cap on top of the violent expressions of the human experience. But I don't think that Jesus wants to cap it. I think what the new kingdom of Jesus is instituting is not just a new political order. I think it's a new human society. It's the people of Jesus as his body, what he intended human society to look like. John Dee says it all the time. The church ought to be what the world would be like if everyone obeyed Jesus. That's profound. Like, we're supposed to be modeling together what God's intention for human social structures look like. And those human social structures, as God intends them, don't include violence and don't include coercion. It's not that we can't, it's that we won't. It's because we recognize that as the fallen backwards way. It's regressive. And anywhere where coercion is being employed, grace is not. Like, what Jesus wants to do in the world has to engage the will and the heart and the whole man. And he's not just controlling and suppressing evil. He's converting it and making it something new. And to enlist in his kingdom and to become a part of what he's doing in the world means to renounce those old means of repression and coercion and control, like stamp it down. And that's what I hear from my Reformed friends all the time, is like, we got to control it. We got to stop it. We got to crush the liberal agenda. We got we got to make the evil go away, and they're just putting it under a lid, and maybe they can do that really well, but it's still under there. It hasn't gone anywhere. But Jesus is taking me, an evil man, and making me something different, and he didn't do that by force, and I'm not going to do it by force either. That's what's the difference. Like, we are supposed to overcome the world. We're supposed to radically make a different world in our wake, but it's not through those old means. And that has to enter into the discussion of what it means to occupy and to be an effective tool in causing the kingdom of God to grow in the earth. When I look into the face,